Hello, and welcome to an ESG video discussion looking at the impacts and implications of emerging trends in big data and storage. I'm your host, Scott Sinclair, a storage analyst here at ESG, and I'm joined by my fellow storage analysts, Terri McClure and Mark Peters, along with our big data analyst, Nick Rouda. Today's theme is how big data is changing the mix of storage technologies. So Terri, with all the various storage technologies that exist today, whether it's unified storage, scale-out storage, or object storage, how does big data impact these various storage technologies? How does it impact the mix across enterprises? And what should vendors do about it?
Unfortunately, storage has not been that easy to manage, and it's been a challenge for users for years, since the inception of external storage. And big data is just adding to this already existing challenge we have with managing the amount of data that we have to store and retain in the enterprise. And there's really three equations that companies are looking for, right? They're looking at the cost of the solution. And big data really introduces some interesting points when you start looking at the cost of the solution, because one of the value props around HDFS is I get to use commodity hardware, I get to just spin everything up with open source, and it's very inexpensive. But there's more to it than that. There's the scalability and the manageability aspects you have to start looking at. There's the time to results things you want to start looking at. So we're seeing a change of mix in the enterprise, somewhat away from the commodity DAS, because there are trade-offs associated with going with other approaches, such as object-based storage for the manageability. Of course, that has challenges. Object storage has proprietary APIs, it has RESTful APIs, but they're seeing the opportunity associated with big data, and they're starting to support HDFS interfaces as well as CIFS and NFS and things like that to standardize. And object storage brings that ability to leverage commodity hardware. It helps with the cost side of the equation. It helps with the manageability side of the equation. So I think as we continue going down this path and data volume continues to grow in the enterprise, I do think we're going to start seeing a shift away from some of those traditional SAN and NAS technologies that are expensive and difficult to manage, and towards more commodity-based, software-defined, we haven't said software-defined yet today, software-defined storage infrastructures like object storage, and the mix will start to shift in the enterprise to support these data volumes.
Okay, thanks, Terri. So Mark, one of the things that Terri mentioned was commodity storage. And one of the things that tends to get associated with that is internal storage drives. Can you talk a little bit about the mix or the dynamic between external storage and internal storage, and where that tipping point is, if it exists at all, for big data?
I think it comes down to a couple of things. I think it comes down to what is the sort of data that is being used and manipulated, obviously, for big data and analytics, and how is it going to be utilized? So there's a function in the first in terms of what data is used, in terms of the scale and the flexibility, and of course budget comes into it. If you can afford to do everything up and close to the processor, that's probably good. But the other thing is, where did this data come from? If you're integrating, for example, I don't know, car sales with weather forecasts and ice cream in Australia or something for some peculiar analytical insight, then you also have the other aspect of this, which is you are sharing data from a number of places, and you may well want to share it both around your own organization and to others, and potentially to the cloud outside of all that. So I think the data that you're using in terms of its scale and its flexibility is going to determine whether you can do things internally to the server, internally to the system, but then how you're actually going to use the data afterwards, where it comes from and where it goes to, is going to determine whether you use network storage or not. I think there's still a lot of emphasis on using network storage. There's a lot of desire to try and do things closer to the server. And as a result of that, I'm not sure exactly that there is a defined tipping point. It will be as a result of the scale and the budgets that are required and available in each individual user.
Thanks, Mark. Continuing on this theme of network storage, and you can't mention big data without mentioning Hadoop. Mm-hmm. We've seen a lot of NAS vendors start integrating HDFS. Mm-hmm. Can you give us your thoughts on HDFS within NAS? Is it real? And what are the impacts?
Well, we're certainly starting to see some level of traction. A lot of companies are playing with HDFS, and I say playing with, they're experimenting with HDFS in the enterprise and trying to figure out where it fits. The challenge is, as Mark just talked about, the DAS versus network storage challenge. Do I put my storage next to my compute and do everything closer to the processor and get faster results, or do I go with an external storage system, and that's the value prop with NAS is I get this external storage system that supports HDFS and it supports NAS. And I get to leverage that data to do other things. Or I get to drop data directly into that NAS shared storage system and leverage it for Hadoop without doing an ETL type exercise to extract the data and load it into the HDFS system. And I can start doing analytics in place. So there's value props associated with using NAS. We are starting to see some traction in the enterprise. Vendors like EMC Isilon, for example, are getting some traction with their unified storage solution that also supports HDFS. Other vendors, object storage vendors like CleverSafe, are starting to see some traction with the HDFS integration. So we're certainly starting to see people look at that and make the equation to figure out, do I want to just use the commodity DAS and do my compute next to my storage, or do I want to deal with possibly a little bit of latency and have that one central storage pool and gain time back with not having to do an ETL operation on the Hadoop side. So there's pluses and minuses to each approach. Certainly NAS is more expensive, but what's the time saving associated with not having to do those ETL processes?
Thanks, Terri. So Nick, for this time we've been talking a lot about on-premise storage techniques, be it external storage or internal storage. What role does public cloud have to play, especially when you're looking at infrastructure as a service or Hadoop as a service offerings?
It's a great question, Scott. We ask customers where they want to put new initiatives in big data, business intelligence, analytics, what have you. About a quarter of the time they say they're looking at public cloud or a hybrid cloud model as opposed to the on-premise type solutions we've been discussing. That has both the pros and cons of traditional cloud solutions. It may be easier to get going, it may seem easier to continue to scale. Your cost short term might be lower, long term may be higher, but as Terri was alluding to, one of the big challenges is trying to get the analytics as close as possible to the data, because when it comes time to actually go crunch some numbers, you don't want to be trying to move a terabyte of data over your T1 line back to another location. So for data that lives in the cloud, I think that's a great place to do analytics. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you're trying to collect data from a lot of different sources, combine on-premise with cloud. You really need to think about where the data is coming from, where it's going to be used, and what's kind of the optimal configuration.
Thanks, Nick. That's a great insight. And this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you for joining us today, and please check out some of the other conversations that we've had on this topic.